So today I wanted to talk about the process, or how we can look at the process and what's actually happening for a seeker. I thought we'd talk about it this way because in a lot of non-dual teachings, the notion of a process is underemphasized. In fact, in some approaches, it's actually denied. There is no such thing as a process, because process involves time. And in certain teachings, the methodology takes the approach of invalidating time, pointing out that time comes into existence when we think about the past and the future. And there's good reason why that approach is taken. If that is the approach where it will be emphasized that all there is this, and there is no past, there is no future, that they're concepts, and that if we overlay those concepts of time onto what is here now, the present moment, which is devoid of time, if we take away the notion of time, if we invalidate the validity of thinking in terms of time, then what has to be taken away is process, because process requires time. It requires stages, which requires time. It requires cause and effect, which requires time. And so in some teachings, the notion of process, the notion of a teaching, the notion of change happening as a gradual process, or as a process of cause and effect, are invalidated, are spoken about as a type of thinking that is part of the illusion. Now, I'm not, as many of you have heard me say, when I talk about a teaching approaching the topic differently, it's in no way saying that that teaching is wrong. What I often say is that I think teachings are ingenious as to how they understand what the problem is, and they come up with a solution to the problem. And so there can be very many different ways of undoing a knot. And teachers can say things that sound contradictory, sound opposite. And if we don't appreciate that that is a strategy or a methodology to undo a particular knot, we might get carried away with the fact that they're saying different things, and not appreciate that saying two different things may still be valid ways of undoing the knot in different ways. So it's important to understand that, and understand that it isn't a criticism of a teaching when one points out, when I point out that the teaching does it differently. I'm pointing it out so that we can then understand what is really meant, or what the purpose of saying it one way is, and then see how saying it differently, using different methodology, can get us to see what the commonality is. Because we'll have to say, well, obviously it's not about whether time exists or time doesn't exist, because one teaching says time is part of life, and the other teaching says seeing concept. It can't be that the teaching is talking about that concept, because if it was, one teaching is right and the other teaching is wrong. So I'll point out, for example, why a teaching will say that there is no time. So one of the reasons is that if we take away causality as being the way that we see things unfolding, if we take away time as being the framework in which we see things unfolding, what happens is the building blocks of our thinking, and especially the thinking creates suffering. The building blocks of the suffering thinking have now been removed from the equation. So a teaching is saying, if ever you are thinking in terms of time, in terms of causality, you are caught in illusion. You are not seeing things clearly. And a seeker is interested in truth. A seeker is interested in seeing things clearly. So if a teaching that they resonate with, that they have a connection with, that they have a faith in, says that time and causality is part of the illusory way of seeing life, essentially it's saying, try to see life differently. Whenever you see yourself interpreting life based on a framework of time and causality, adjust it. Do it differently. That's what the teachings are saying. And in planting that seed, what is happening is that the basis on which the suffering thinking rests, they did that to me. They did it yesterday. The person did this before. Not now, the person did it before. Because suffering often is horizontal thinking, where an event is stretched out horizontally in time. Essentially, we hold on to something that happened in the past. And then we create a narrative about the person who should have acted differently, because the way they acted delivered pain to me. And so if a teaching is saying that's not how life unfolds, life doesn't unfold according to causality and time, that's just an appearance. That actually whatever is happening is always spontaneously arising, no causality to it. So the event that happened wasn't undertaken or didn't happen in the way that we traditionally see things happening, as being a series of cause and effect. And so then our thinking about something that happened in the past is validating the notion of a past, a present, and a future. And so the teaching comes in and says, that's not valid, stop thinking that way. All there is now. And it has the effect of cutting off the suffering thinking. It has the effect of bringing your attention to what is here, which our thinking is very good at ignoring when it is attached or holding on to something that happened in the past. When it's holding on to something that happened in the past, it essentially drags it into the present as if it's happening now, as if it exists. Now, so I'm just explaining why a teaching might say there is no such thing as the past or the future, because it's an effective way of cutting off a narrative that is a narrative that creates an uncomfortableness and disturbs what we could call the pristine present moment, In other words, we could say peace of mind. It is an effective way of cutting off that narrative. So there's a usefulness in saying things don't happen according to cause and effect. Meaning, if a sound is happening, it's not coming from a bird. So if there is chirping, certain teachings will point out that the sound is arising independent of the bird. The bird is not the cause of the sound. It just appears like the bird is the cause of the sound, but actually everything is arising spontaneously in the present moment with no causality. This is why life is often described as illusory, because the illusion is that there is causality, that the sound is created by the bird. And if we look at the present moment, we can see it through this lens of no causality. Now, I'm not saying that that is absolutely true. In fact, I would tend to say that an integrated understanding, an integrated non-dual understanding, or we can leave the non-dual out of it even, it's not about whether it's non-dual or not, but an integrated understanding that delivers whatever liberation is or enlightenment is, requires us to see life as causal, to be able to appreciate that part of the paradox. And when I say paradox, is because we can also see life as spontaneous, but they shouldn't be held as either or positions. They are complementary, they coexist. And so this capacity to see life as causal and simultaneously understand it as spontaneous is what makes up the paradox. So if someone says, is life spontaneous? You'd say yes. Is life causal? You'd say yes. Someone might say it can't be both, and it can. That's what paradox is. Paradox is where two seemingly contradictory positions are actually complementary. So in this complementary way of seeing it, we can appreciate the teachings that are pointing out one side of the paradox or one side of the coin. And remember, a coin is a coin because it has two sides. So it's not a matter of choosing which side of the coin is real or which side of the coin is true. They both coexist. They are both as real or unreal as each other. So a teaching that emphasizes the spontaneity and the non-causal nature of life is valid. And a teaching that talks about the causality in life, the time-boundness of life, is also correct. A teaching that says there is no such thing as process is correct. And a teaching that says anything that happens in life is part of a causal process. So causality will talk about something like evolution, a gradual change over time. The teaching of spontaneity will talk about human beings not being, or the world as we know it, not being the result of a gradual change over time. So in other words, it's pointing out that life is not an objective reality that is affected by change over time, but rather it's a spontaneous appearance that arises in its completeness now out of absolute nothing and spontaneously arises in its completeness, which means the tree that is a fully mature tree that exists in your experience never started off as a sapling. Didn't start off as a seed and grow into a little seedling and then become a small tree and then a bigger tree and now a very big mature tree. Is the mature tree has spontaneously appeared in this present moment as part of the experience that arises in consciousness. This is this might take some some mulling over in order for someone to appreciate how two descriptions of life that seem so contradictory, so in opposition with each other, can be part of the paradox of life. Now, a lot of coming to understand how this can be has to do with appreciating that all we have as our experience of life is exactly that, a momentary experience. And I'm not using the word experience as I described it in the last satsang that talks about subject-object relationship. I'm talking about experience as a word that describes the experience of life. Now, that experience of life could be a oneness experience of life, where the experience includes no sense of a separate subject aware of an object outside of itself. And if that happens, we would just say that is the experience of life, and the experience happens to be an experience without subject-object relationship. Or there can be an experience of life which is what most people's experience of life is, where there is a sense of I am the body, the subject, aware of objects outside of myself. And as we develop in life as human beings, that experience, which is all that life ever is to us, or all we ever have of life, is an experience. So if you remember your 5th birthday party and you're blowing out the candles, that was the experience in the present moment, was of a 5-year-old taking a breath and blowing out the candles. And that was the experience of life in that moment. And here we are now experiencing life. It's another experience in this moment. And the experience in each moment is replaced by a new experience. And what do I mean by experience? When we really look at it, when we really investigate what experience is, it's not entirely what it appears. It appears like, oh, there is a body that is having an experience of an external world. Now, the experience itself is an experience of a body and an external world. But it doesn't mean that there is a body and an external world, but rather the experience of a body and an external world. And where does this experience happen? What we will come to appreciate if we become interested in what is experience, we might start to get a hint or an inclination that fundamental to experience is awareness of the experience. That without awareness of, or rather just awareness, there can't be the experience of a tree, the experience of bird song, the experience of speaking, the experience of the taste of strawberry. We might start to realize that all of life, all of the senses are experience, are objects, are objects of experience. And we can break that down into sight, sound, taste, smell, touch. And so it's a multi-sensory experience of sense objects and thoughts and feelings and emotions. And there has to be awareness of all of those things. And the awareness for understanding what experience is can be, we should sort of decouple or challenge the concept that awareness belongs to the body, and rather start to appreciate that the body is a result of sense objects within the experience. So there is the awareness of a hand and a leg and all parts of the body because of the senses, or because they arise as sense objects in the experience. And the body is one part of the visual sense object. So we can look at the visual sense object as not a whole lot of separate visual sense objects, but one large visual sense object, of which the body is just part of that visual sense object. So the table and the chairs and the trees and the other people, there is a visual component to those objects. And in totality, all of the visual, including the body, in totality, that is the visual component or visual object of the overall experience. And as well as seeing the visual of the body, then there's another layer, which is the touch sense. And that's why I say it's a multi-sensory experience. So we could look at it like the experience is made up of layers: the visual layer, the sound layer, the touch layer. And each layer fits together to create a cohesive overall experience that we know as the experience of time and space and causality. That's how the experience ends up feeling. Now, where is this experience happening? We could say it's happening in the mind of God. At first, because we're so wedded to life being something to do with the human body, a teaching will come in and say, to help us become aware of life as experience, saying the experience is happening in consciousness. And consciousness is God, or the experience is happening in awareness, and awareness is God. All there is consciousness, all there is awareness. All there is Brahman. All there is God. This is one of the interpretations of what non-duality is talking about. That the experience of the world is an arising, an appearance, an experience in awareness. Awareness is the truth. Awareness is really all that there is. And the experience of life is just the continuous modulation arising in awareness, recognized by awareness, and ultimately we can say made of nothing but awareness. And that's why we're often introduced to the notion of a dream. Because a dream is the appearance of a world of form, a world of time and space, that is not really that. When we look at a dream in hindsight with the capacity to see it from outside, meaning from once we wake up, we see, wow, all of that was an illusion. All of that was a creation, an appearance in consciousness, and that the ocean in the dream was nothing more than experience in the consciousness of mind. And so likening life to a dream is done in order for us to maybe appreciate, to shift from seeing all of the objects that we know as physical objects, as objectively real objects, and maybe starting to appreciate them as experience. And as nuances come in, as concepts are introduced that get us to see something like the table or the chair as something that is continually in change, continually in flux, it then gets us to think about the table differently. Because when we look at a table without a concept that says the table is continually changing, the table is never the same. Without that concept, we look at a table and for all intents and purposes, it's unchanging. And so if we look at the table as if it's unchanging, what happens is it creates the relationship to the table that prevents us from seeing life as an appearance. Because for us to appreciate life as an appearance, we need to see the changeability of it. We need to see how the objects in the appearance, in the experience, are not objectively real or true. And so one of the mental concepts that's introduced to break our relationship to an object, whereby we say that object is true as it appears, is for us to hear about how the table is continually changing. Millisecond to millisecond, it is different. And by bringing our appreciation of the table from one of the table being constant over hours, being the same table, over days, over months, it's the same table. And as our thinking about the table is one that appreciates that the table is completely changing every millisecond, then we're changing our relationship to what is actually in front of us. And so it's not only the table that is continually changing, but it's everything in the experience that is continually changing. Now, we can talk about the table continually changing on a level of matter. that the matter is continually changing. That might be the segue into seeing it all as an experience. When we talk about it as continually changing on the level of matter, we're still not introducing the notion that life is just experience, because we're still validating the notion that the table is made of solid particles. But we have now loosened our more rigid idea of the table into a soup of energy. And if we introduce into the mix that the table is only there when we are aware of it, it only exists when we're aware of it, that notion really starts to challenge the idea of the objectiveness of the world and its objects. Because our standpoint is the table is an objectively real object that exists independent of me being aware of it or not. That's the starting point. That's how we tend to develop in life from a baby into a child and then adult, is with this relationship that the table, is there when we walk out of the room remains there, the table remains there. And a teaching that is trying to point out that life is an experience will say, that's part of the illusion. You have to stop believing that the table remains there when you're not aware of it. And we might think, well, every time I go back into the room, the table is there. And so that tells me that the table has always been there. So we need to start maybe reassessing and seeing that the table is only ever there when we are aware of it. Does it exist when we're not aware of it? And all of this is there, hopefully, to bring attention to the present moment as an experience. If you turn your head, a whole lot of objects that we assume are in the room are no longer in the experience. But there is still a complete experience. And so what the teachings, whichever methodologies approach, are trying to do is bring about an appreciation that there is experience, and that's all that our life is, the experience as it is in each moment. And the experience includes the table or it doesn't include the table. It includes a person or it doesn't include a person. And so it starts to challenge our notion that, London is out there on the other side of the world, or Australia is out there on the other side of the world. And says, actually, all there is this. And there is no here and there. And it's trying to get us to appreciate the truth of the experience itself, the undeniability of the table as an experience that is being had. There is an experience of a table, but is there any proof of your car or your parents, unless they are in the experience? And we'll say, no, but I saw them this morning and I'll see them this evening, so they must be there now. Saying, don't make assumptions. Don't believe your thinking. Your thinking may be obscuring you from seeing the truth. That all that exists is this experience. this momentary experience, however it exists. And it is our assumption that life is an objective reality that continues independent of the experience that prevents us from knowing life as it really is. Prevents us from appreciating life as an experience in which a body is part of the experience. But what is aware of the body? What is aware of the table? So if we continue to only know life as an objective reality, which means, there is a table out there and I see the table out there. I see the table that is outside of myself. It means we're not appreciating what life really is. Because as what I'm emphasizing, life is not the awareness of a table outside of you, but rather life is the experience that includes within the singular experience the presence of a table that is not really a table separate from everything else. It is a table appearing in the experience. And if you turn what we call turning one's head, the table disappears. It is no longer in the field of awareness. And so it is no longer in, for all intents and purposes, part of the momentary experience. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have heard these explorations, these teachings that will emphasize the illusory nature of time, because if we look at the present moment, the present moment experience, we'll see that a memory of the past is just an object, a thought object, arising in the present moment that brings in to existence the notion or the idea that there was actually a past. If we take the memory out, we remain, an experience remains, but without introducing a contrasting image, which is simply a memory. And a memory doesn't mean it actually happened. A memory in this context refers to a thought object that arises, that creates the impression that something happened in the past, that I was 5 years old in the past. And so as we see that a memory is a spontaneous thought, and it doesn't prove that that happened, we can then start to maybe get a sense of how the illusion of life, the illusion of time, is created by the insertion of certain objects, thought objects, which we call memory. Now, not all thought objects are memory, but memory is a type of thought object. And for a long time, memory will arise and we won't appreciate it as a thought object. We will assume that it is telling us what happened. As we see it as a thought object, we may in fact question whether the fact that it arises is proof that it happened. And when we start to investigate our memory and see that often we're convinced that something happened, but then we find out that it didn't happen the way we remember it, then we start to see the fallibility of memory. And we could imagine that if all of life experience is a mystical creation, how memory could be inserted without a past ever happening. So in a night dream, you have the main character might be spontaneously created within the dream, didn't exist 2 seconds before, and then the dream arose and the the main character arose in the dream, and that main character has a memory of having lived yesterday, and that memory is clearly just an object in the dream creating the impression of yesterday. When the dream collapses, the main character and all his memories collapse with it, with the dream, and then there's a spontaneous emergence of a new dream, let's say, and the character may have a memory of growing up as a child, which didn't ever happen. Now, it might sound like I'm saying, this is the truth, this is reality, this is how life is. Life is just an experience, that there is no causality. And if you've heard the teachings that come at describing life from this angle, they will describe life this way in a fairly rigid and consistent and non-giving way, that there absolutely is no time. There is no causality. Everything is spontaneously arising. And that is because the mission is to create a shift, an awakening that appreciates the present moment as experience, which then means we have to question so much of what we assume to be true. And why is it important to question so much of what we assume to be true? Because based on our assumptions of what is true, life is suffering. Right? Based on our interpretation of how life is, what has arisen as part and parcel of that interpretation of life is a narrative about who I am and who the other is and what life is, that creates an uncomfortableness of oneself. And so we're being asked to reassess life, and so the teachings are trying to bring about a shift that allows us to see life in a different light, and then adjust all of our thinking in line with how life is now seen. And so much of the suffering thinking can no longer be sustained in this new view of life. A view of life that is described in the teachings that approach liberation from that point of view as the reality, the truth, the end of illusion. But remember, I started off by saying that life is a paradox, and that at some point we're going to have to be able to hold two perspectives as complementaries. Now, if we hold the notion that time and causality is the untrue, and spontaneity, meaning seeing everything as just an experience in consciousness, is the truth, then we have essentially separated life into viewing it as ignorance or untrue, or understanding or truth. And so that means that we need to see it as truth and not as ignorance, not as untruth, which means that view is never going to bring the two together, never bring them together as the paradox, or two parts of the paradox, two sides of a coin. So how can we come up with an explanation that holds or brings these two perspectives together? And why don't some teachings do that? And the answer is that the teachings that say life is like this and not like that, so spontaneous with no causality, why does a teaching do that? And the answer is because we develop in life fixated with life only being causality, and therefore not being able to see the other side of the paradox. And the teaching appreciates that, and it says the thinking is so invested in that being the truth, where in fact it's only half the truth, let's say, or half of the paradox, that because it's so invested in that as being the whole truth, a teaching needs to basically break that investment by at first saying that is the ignorance, that is the untrue, and pointing at the other side of the paradox, the other side of the coin, as the truth. And what that can do is challenge our beliefs, especially when we find ourselves resonating with a teaching and hearing the teaching as truth. We hear the teaching saying that what we know life as was illusion and the truth is something very different. And so that can shock our system. It can be received by us and trusted enough to only see it as it's described, which can create a big enough shock to the system that gets us to see life radically differently. That has its own problems, because when that shift happens, the tendency is to then only see life that way, to no longer be able to hold the notion of a past and a future, because in fact the shift has been a shift that has come about because the teaching says there is no such thing as a past and a future. And so we are now seeing life radically differently, and in my estimation, ignoring aspects of life that are present, that have been in a way excluded by the teaching, and now no longer able to be seen even though they continue to exist. And so we might find ourselves saying there is no such thing as good or bad, because the teaching will bring that in. There is no such thing as good or bad, and there's good reason why that is said. But then the seeker that has had that shift will have trouble acknowledging life in a way that on some level distinguishes pleasure from pain, good from bad, because that way of thinking has been disabled. Now there's a benefit to that and there's a cost to that. And at some point, some refining needs to happen where the rigidity of seeing life this new way loosens up, and there can be an appreciation for some things that still exist that we may have been overlooking. And so I'd like to bring in a suggestion that life is an experience. That the experience itself is an experience of a body, but it doesn't tell us that there is a body out there. It doesn't prove that there is a body having an experience, Because as we investigate the present moment, we'll find that all there is experience. However, if we hold the framework that says there is an external world, an objective world with a human being in it, with other human beings in it, there is a world of trees and tables, and the trees and tables continue to exist even when there is an awareness of the tables and chairs, because they are objects made of matter in the objective world that is made of matter and does unfold according to laws of physics and cause and effect. And there is a human instrument, an animal in that world, and that animal has the faculty of awareness. And without the faculty of awareness, or without that animal in the external world, the world would be there, but there would be no experience of it. And so as soon as an animal in the world comes along with the faculty of awareness, so really a conscious, an aware animal, then there is experience of that objective world. And what we have is exactly that, the experience of what we can assume is an objective world out there. However, let's be sure that we see the experience of what we can assume is the experience of an objective world is in fact just the experience of it, which means a model of it, a visual model, a sound model, a touch model, a modulation of that actuality that is out there. And then that assumes that the body is a reproduction of the actual body in the actual world out there. And the experience we have of the walls and the tables and the chairs is a reproduction of the objects as they are in the external world. Now, I'm not saying that this is absolutely what life is, but it's what presents, and if that's the case, if there's an objective world out there that we are aware of, and the experience that we have is the modulation, the representation of what is out there. And remember, the representation is going to be a limited version of what's out there. If we had extra senses, our representation of the world, our modulation of the world could include, I don't know, X-ray wave. We would see layers of the world that are not represented in our experience. So we don't, our experience of life, the representation, the modulation of the world doesn't include seeing things at a microscopic level. So our representation is a representation on the macro level. It could be that if we were a different instrument, we would have a different representation. So flies, the animal, the fly, would have a different representation of the world. It may be much more simplistic, and they might just see vague movement. And what they know themselves as is going to be different in their recreation of the world. They may not know themselves as an object in a world. So it's very hard for us to know what awareness of the world a fly has and what awareness of itself the fly has. But essentially, we could just say that there will be a representation, a modulation, a representation of the external reality from the perspective of whatever animal is aware of it. And so we know the human, and in particular your own awareness of the objective world. As I said, no, we don't know. I'm not saying that this is absolutely the case. In fact, traditional Advaita, because its job is really to awaken someone to the experience and ultimately to the awareness that is aware of the experience, and in bringing about that awareness and that awakening, gravitating into that layer of what I would end up saying is a layer of the human being. So that's what the awakening is doing, is trying to bring about a shift such that there can be a grounding in the awareness layer. Now, the awareness layer is essentially a step back from being grounded and identified with being the body. So when there is a identification, knowing oneself as the body, life is received as very personal. And if there's a shift and life is awared from the perspective of awareness, where the body is just seen as an object and felt within the experience, because there's a qualitative change in the experience when this shift happens, then there is a shift that makes life feel less personal, makes whatever is happening to the body feel on some level as if it's not happening to what I am. Because the shift now is I am awareness, in which the whole experience of life arises, and the experience of life is continually changing. The body is part of the experience that is continually changing, and I can't be something that is continually changing. I am that which is aware of what is continually changing. And so that, you could say, is a significant change in the psychology of the human being. It feels like there is no human being when that shift happens. But what I'm suggesting is that the teachings are bringing in new conditioning that changes the human being such that their experience of life changes. And the point is not to have an experience of life that changes such that you no longer know yourself as human. The point is for the experience to change such that eventually you come back to knowing yourself as human with less involvement, less attachment to how the experience unfolds, meaning to what the storyline of your life is, less dependence on outcomes. And that less dependence on outcome happens when there is a change in the human being that can appreciate the experience of life as an experience and recognize that in order for there to be experience, there has to be awareness. So remember, in the objective world out there that we never really know, there is, let's say, a human being that has awareness, and that human object with awareness is interpreting the external world that is a world outside of it and representing it for themselves to be aware of as the experience that we have. And so when we point at the body, on the one level we can sort of say, well, this is what is having the experience, but at the same time appreciate that what I'm pointing at is the representation of what is having the experience. So all we ever know is the representation of what is out there. However, so it's very important for us to see life as an experience. But then at some point we say the experience needs to be lived as if it is a world of time and space and form and causality. Because what it might well be is a representation of a world of time and space and causality. A representation of an objective world. And so that's where we can hold the paradox together, where we say there is memory because there actually is time and space and causality in the actual world. And those events did happen, but they get held as thought, as memory, and appear as part of the experience. So if we can appreciate that the experience of life is exactly that experience, then on the one hand, all we ever have is a spontaneous arising in consciousness, which is the experience. But that doesn't mean that there isn't time out there, that there isn't causality out there. It doesn't mean that a teaching isn't actually being received by a human being that is changing because of the effect of the teaching, which that means causality. And so the happy medium, the correct balance, is where we get to live as if we are this human being, the human being that we have the experience of, connected to the essence, which is, you could say, fundamentally more real than the objects of experience, than the content of the experience. The essence is the awareness that is aware of the content. And so if we're aware, if there is an awareness of the awareness, we can know ourselves more fully, which means know ourselves not only as the physical, but also as the formless awareness. And appreciate that this spontaneous arising, this experience of life, is always an experience of daily living, of experiencing pleasure and pain. And so at some point we say, but so that's what life is. Life is the experience of living in a world of time and space and form. And actually out there, which we never have access to, it may be exactly that, as is represented in what I'm suggesting is a representation of what is out there. And that's when we say, well, even if what I have is just the experience, I have to live as if that is real. I have to live as if cause and effect is real, because that's how things unfold. And so the happy medium is where we get to live as the human being, as if time and space is unreal, connected to the core of who we are, which means our consciousness, because remember, in the objective world, the human being that is out there is a conscious human being. So now we are aware of the consciousness, and in that experience, there is also the sense of being a physical entity, which means we may know ourselves quite well as a conscious physical entity. And if we can have a relationship to what happens in life that is not fully identified with outcomes, meaning we understand that even when outcomes are not pleasure, 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 we can rest in our own being and find ourselves at peace and content. And we find ourselves at peace and content when a certain psychology, which is essentially the psychology that was put in place with the old way of knowing life, when that psychology falls away, and the basis of that psychology is the belief in personal doership, that if something happened, I made it happen. Now, the I that we have embedded in our belief system is I, the doer, in control of everything. Now, if there is a human being in the objective world, that human being is essentially, as I've described many times, a biological instrument that has been designed by life. It's got a genetic makeup that grew it, and at some point it became conscious. That's part of its design. And then the external world has conditioned it to not only be a genetic structure, but one that is conditioned as a result of its experience in life. And so that entity out there is essentially a biological robot, and we have a representation of the life experience that it's having. And so if we can appreciate that what we are is a biological instrument designed by life as part of life, and that all of life, this objective world out there that is a objective world of impersonal physics, including the physics that has grown the human being and is moving the human being. So all of the thoughts are essentially electromagnetic pulses in a very complex brain that makes the human being out there function. And we have the representation of the world in which that human being interacts with other human beings. And so our attitude can change to, I have the experience, but I won't interpret the experience as being my doing. I won't interpret the speaking as being my speaking, but rather a happening that is happening to the human being out there, but it's happening according to the design of life. And that attitude of not taking myself as the doer, not taking the other as the doer, and especially not feeling like my sense of self is determined by outcomes, but rather my sense of self is known to be something independent of outcomes, because we can rest in the core of who we are. If that sets in place, then that's what I would describe as the most optimal way of being in life, because it means that we appreciate life as an experience. We get to live as if life is real, and at the same time without the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome, which, if it's in place, would lead to guilt and blame and pride and worry and expectation, which are all different forms of human suffering. So if that attitude is not in place, and in fact there is an attitude which we could call non-doership and non-attachment, we live as a human being, but without guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. And that essentially means we remain connected to our core, which allows us to live life peacefully, regardless of the circumstance that unfold. So this particular satsang was a little different in that it emphasized what experience is. Whereas ordinarily the emphasis is on the non-doership, and the non-doership really just says, well, we are the human being, and the human being is a biological instrument designed by life, conditioned by life, and functioning according to life. And it doesn't put so much emphasis on the awareness and the experience aspect. So hopefully coming at it this way allows us to understand how, even if there is an objective world of time and space, the experience of it is what we get to know. And after we've awakened to it as being an experience, then we end up living the experience and say, well, I have to live the experience as if it's an experience of an external world, which is what it feels like.